I do think organizations have a responsibility to pay livable wages. I also think other people have some responsibility around that, which is government and, the support around that. But one is because, and that's where some of the pay justice terminology comes in, is that, if you really, for instance, are committed to diversity, equity, inclusion, if you're not paying people a livable wage out of the gate, you're limiting who you're recruiting.
Good morning, HR. I'm Mike Coffey, president of Imperative, premium background checks with fast and friendly service. And this is the podcast where I talk to business leaders about bringing people together to create value for shareholders, customers, and the community. Please follow, rate, and review Good Morning HR wherever you get your podcast. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or at goodmorninghr.com. Pay transparency, pay equity, and more recently, pay justice are terms that I'm encountering more and more at HR conferences and in people strategy thought pieces. But while these terms sound warm and fuzzy, who's really opposed to equity or justice? What do these terms really mean when we're talking about them in an organizational sense? And what does pursuing them in a meaningful way mean to an organization? Joining me today to discuss all of this is Sally Loftis. Sally is an HR consultant specializing in people strategy and pay equity. She is also the managing director at Loftis Partners, the consulting firm she founded in 2020 and through which she has worked with clients across 3 continents. Welcome to Good Morning HR, Sally.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
So let's just start with definitions, and then we can just break those down through our conversation. But what are pay transparency, pay equity, and pay justice? And if those aren't in the right order to break them down, whatever's easiest for you. But what do those terms really mean?
I'm game. There are a lot of terms used, so let's go for it. So pay transparency is definitely a term that people have gotten more familiar with from a legal compliance standpoint from a HR. So there have been states, territories, cities that have passed pay transparency laws, and not all of those laws are the same, for the record. Depending on where you are, it may be how big your business is, what you have to report. So pay transparency is typically you're reporting. If you're in the United States, it's going to be you're probably putting the salary range for a job opening out there. So that's typically what that is. Actually, like for instance, in England, there's more in-depth reporting. So if we were talking about other continents, that'd be a different conversation. But so then pay equity is a term, and I kind of use it as an umbrella term. There's some things underneath it. So pay equity is making sure that, generally is going to be people are being paid the same across jobs. And then there's a term pay parity, which I kind of fold into pay equity, is that, people of different demographics, whether it might be gender, race, ethnicity, are being paid equally across an organization. So I typically kind of lump all that together in pay equity. And then pay justice is a term that I use in thinking about kind of the systemic work that we're doing around pay, because our traditional compensation models are broken, at least in my opinion. And so really trying to look at new ways and new frameworks to pay people in equitable ways is really about pay justice.
Okay, so then let's start with that pay transparency thing. Colorado, they passed their pay transparency law that they at least insist that is applicable to any employer posting any job that may be filled by a Colorado citizen or applied to by a Colorado citizen. And it basically says you've got to have a pay range posted. And New York City's got a similar law, and it's caught on like wildfire in the last 18 months or so. I'll let you dive into what's the reason for posting those ranges?
I would say advocates for those laws would say the reasoning is about bringing some level of equity into roles, having an idea of kind of what people are paying out there from an organizational standpoint. I will say, when I work with organizations, the reasoning there can be multiple reasons. One is obviously there's legal compliance, but two is that it's really one way to bring a level of transparency and trust into the recruitment process. And then also it's really, if you're looking at, for instance, posting salary ranges and your job openings, if you've not had that conversation internally with within your organization, that might be a surprise to some people in the organization. So if you can get out ahead of that, that's also a trust building action that you can take with your employees internally.
So, on the legislative front, the argument is that employers should post that information in order to what? I mean, because you're talking about a band or a wage, a range. So how does transparency serve a public, a public interest from the point of view
Yeah.
of legislators anyway?
Yeah, it's definitely about it's a level of accountability for organizations that they haven't had before. It's also a level of being able to kind of check what the equity portion, kind of how people are being paid, the equity portions around, what a certain position, a lot of organizations are required to, internally report pay data to the government, right? And so this is kind of more of a public view of that. Obviously, these laws are not all inclusive of every role all over the United States, but it's really kind of trying to open the curtain on pay at organizations and have more transparency with these groups.
So if there are groups that are traditionally, significantly underpaid for same job, same educational choices, job, tenure and role, those things. Um, the argument is that some groups are paid less or offered less or end up making less in those roles. What's the when we say accountability? What does that really mean? What do we really? Who's accountability for what?
Yeah, that's a great question. I appreciate you kind of pushing into this. Is that, there's been a lot of research as well around negotiation. So there's some level of, there will be organizations who post ranges and maybe it's not the full range of a job because they expect people to negotiate. So this is kind of answering your question. This is one level of accountability around equity as well. Is that if you're posting that range, people have an idea of what they're getting into, and if it's actually the full range, which would be what the laws require, they know what the negotiation space is, right? Versus just kind of relying upon who are the best negotiators in a process, because there's been lots of research in there around bias in negotiation, in different demographic identities and intersectional identities. So that's one piece, is that if everybody's starting from the same negotiation space, that opens up some equity there.
And I guess dovetailing in that with that are, a number of jurisdictions have said that employers can't inquire into what an employee's previous salaries or candidates' previous salaries were at a role, and what's their logic behind that?
Yeah, is that, some of these salary history bands that people have gone into is really, again, about not trying to lowball people, in the salary standpoint, of, just because somebody maybe has made less in a previous position, you know, doesn't necessarily mean you should pay them at that level, right? Eliminating the questions around salary history, again, kind of takes some of the conscious and unconscious bias out of those hiring decisions. And it's just kind of another level of accountability in that process. Not all inclusive, but
Mhm.
one step of it.
And certainly from the employer point of view, the logic makes sense that if I post this pay range, and it's the true pay range that I'm really willing to consider for this role, this is the value in hard dollars that this role brings to our production. It's not has nothing to do with personal value of this person as a person, anything like that. This is, and people mix those things up a lot in memes and stuff like that on the internet, but the real value of the work to the output and how we serve our customers. But I wouldn't want to, if I'm on the low end of the market, let's say, for that role, I wouldn't want to interview a bunch of people who are going to be outside of that salary expectation. And
Hmm.
I think too often I've seen it in over my HR career and working with clients that often they end up in a position where the candidate they want, of course they want, because this is the candidate who has excelled and been able to go find the more, win the more competitive positions, the higher paying positions, and has built more experience doing those higher level jobs, even though the job title may be very similar. Why waste your time or theirs? And I hear the argument on the flip side. Well, we've got an amazing culture, and people would want to come work here, but they're eliminating us because we don't pay what they think. Well, you can put that in your job posting too, and how competitive,
Mhm.
how compelling that is to somebody who's looking to jump ship, jump ship from their current employer for a better paying position. And certainly nobody wants to go down in culture. Nobody wants to select a less favorable place to work, but you have to be pretty darn good to make to not just to justify a pay decrease, and so you have to be really miserable in your current position. So I think from that point of view, it makes a lot of sense for employers.
Yeah, I love what you said there about like a lot of times I work with clients around like who are you competing for talent? Like what's your, kind of what's the talent pool you're in and where are you willing to compete and where are you not willing to compete? So I work with a lot of small businesses and nonprofits which tend to have less money,
Hmm.
coming in for salary and benefits. So it is like you said the culture. Or it could be like an unlimited time off or, kind of different benefits and just even having that conversation within the organization to say, okay, we may not be able to compete with this group that pays double what we are, but we can say what we can offer and realize that people may leave, but if they, have a, like you said, a really strong culture, a, who have a flexible schedule and have a culture that supports that, right, which
Right.
can be separate sometimes,
Mhm.
then people may be willing to stay because they have a really great leader. They're able to kind of work on their own schedule, things like that that can be just as important as paying benefits.
And in a perfect world, an employer would really have a strong sense of what this value really is of this role, and this is what we're really willing to pay, and what somebody made at their previous employer. That employer's value of that role shouldn't necessarily drive what how we value this person's contribution in this other role. But there are organizations that just operate very differently, and uh, and if they've got a really if they just call everybody an engineer and there's not engineer 1, 2, 3, 4, then maybe there is some market information being shared there with that high. This person was making 20% higher than what our engineers make. So there's some market information being that's what prices are, and so maybe we need to reevaluate what we're doing, or maybe we assume that this person, or we make an initial assumption until we get to the interview that this person is going to bring a higher level of value, and if we don't know what they were making, then maybe we're having to look for other clues as to what their value might be.
Yeah, that's a great frame on that of just, if you working in HR for many years of, yeah, sometimes you might be like, oh, I'm not going to interview this candidate because they're obviously overqualified or they're already making more than what we can pay. And so you may not interview them. Because and like you
Right.
said, you're kind of having to check your own assumptions, but some of that data we can have our own biases. It may be that person really has heard really great things about your organization or really wants that job because it's in a specific geographic location or there's some kind of benefit you have, things like that. So I really appreciate that you frame it in that because it can't, sometimes you think about the salary history band and it'd be like, well, we're just trying to hide that this person's going to get a 40% pay bump. But sometimes it's people are paid more than what we're looking at and we can weed them out of the candidate pool just because of those things.
So then pay equity,
Hmm.
and you tied pay parity in there. If I'm right, that's what you're really saying is that just looking demographically at people in the same role and making sure there aren't unexplained gaps in how we compensate them.
Yeah, definitely. I start with organizations and doing a pay equity assessment And it's really looking at, to your point, typically if they have salary bands. So there's some organizations I work with that don't even have salary bands, right?
Right.
So it may be that's the starting place. But then looking at, okay, do you have people within the salary band and have some people who are outliers? From a pay perspective. And that may be because they went through a merger or acquisition, right? And sometimes you inherit people,
Right.
into your pay systems that you don't make choices on. But, is there a pattern there, maybe in this certain department or in this certain role? And then we'll look at around gender, race, and ethnicity. We'll look at tenure, because that's typically one where you might see the longer people have been with the organization, maybe their salaries aren't growing as fast as people who've come in. So that might be a sign that there's some salary compression within the organization. We look at kind of highest paid, lowest paid departments. Sometimes people can pay differently based, maybe it was 5 years ago, this skill was super hot and they had to pay more, for this skill, and they've never kind of adjusted back to what the market is. So there's a lot of different things that can come up in pay equity as you start kind of drilling down into your data.
So you have to be an organization of a certain size to really have that much data, though, right? I mean, a small organization that's doing payroll in house on whatever system that they've got, with 50 or 60 employees. They may not have all of those data points just to run crosstabs and do all the data manipulation. What would it look like for a small to medium sized organization that really wanted to do that kind of equity analysis?
Yeah, that's a great question because I do run into sometimes the first kind of intervention in my work is let's talk about what pay data you do have access to, and are you able to look at it? And if you aren't, then let's talk about that. So actually, I'm working with a client right now has 15 employees, and so we really looked at like the issue there was kind of there wasn't like the stair step as you go up in the bands, like a strong enough stair step process of growing your pay as you went up in the bands. And so we're working on that right now. But yeah, part of it is some people just don't even have the data. Some people don't collect enough of the data, for instance. And so sometimes it may be like actually give them an Excel spreadsheet to start with, right? And just say, let's work with the data here because maybe their system doesn't always pull the data in the way they need it. And so we're having to kind of, I think people call it Frankenstein the data,
Mm-hmm.
a little bit into this so then we can look at it.
And so we may even have to manually go through and figure out, okay, these are the demographic areas we want to be sure that we're examining. So maybe we don't have gender in our payroll
Hmm.
system, or
Yeah.
which is probable if it's strictly a payroll system and not a fearful HRS. Uh, age, race, national origin, things like those that could be things that you just have to go through and either pull from multiple sources or just sit down and somebody goes through like we sometimes do with our EEO demographic data, and we just have to pick the candidate or the applicant doesn't fill out the EEO data, so we just you just sit down and you say, okay, well, based on this experience, my experience in this area, this is what how I'm going to categorize them for reporting purposes. And so, but at least that's better, I guess, than not doing anything, and or just ignoring those data points. So
Yeah. I
yeah,
usually, or
no,
sorry,
go
I was
ahead,
going to
please.
say, I was going to say, and I usually will work with some groups. Sometimes there is like a column of we don't know. And that's okay because some people choose not to share their data, right?
Mm-hmm.
If they have, and sometimes it's helping them expand categories. So they may, for gender, they may only have two options, or, race and ethnicity, they may need to expand their options. So that's even an element of kind of working with groups.
So while we're still on pay equity, I mean, we hear the number, male and female numbers of 25, roughly 27% gap between men and women in general in the U.S. Regardless of occupation, experience, and they just and a lot of that is self-selection and other experiences that are outside of the employer's, really way outside. It's either public policy or cultural issues that are outside of the employer's control. But if I'm right, the most recent data is that it's between a nickel to 7 cents per dollar, and adjusted for position and experience, which is still a significant number. I mean,
Mhm.
I don't want to be
Yeah.
paid 7% less than, but I'm
Right.
always the best. I'm always the best employee any place I'm at.
Of
So that's
course
of
you
course I
are.
am.
Of course. Of
But
course.
so that's still I don't want to minimize that gap. But if that's if we're talking about that trying to close that gap, you know, what are the most meaningful ways to begin to do that?
Mhm. Yeah, thank you for that question, and I get asked that a lot because it's typically about in the US, it's about 16% is what the gender pay gap is. As you start adding race and ethnicity onto that,
Mhm.
for instance, um, Latin women, it's, 53 cents to the dollar. So that's a significant gap,
And
right?
again, you're talking about that whole demographic,
General, right,
regardless
right.
of occupation. Okay.
Exactly, exactly.
And so you've got an immigrant, you've got a lot of immigrant
Mhm,
population there, a lot of, or in first generation population. I'm thinking fewer education opportunities, things like that would drive, and just being female, a lot of choices of or necessities, maybe even around
mhm,
childcare. And we've talked about childcare several times on this podcast about the crisis that's facing employers and employees in that area. So that would be a big. So Hispanic
mhm,
females would have a significant issue
mhm.
in that gap. Okay.
Yeah, so and like you said, those are some systemic
Hmm.
issues, right? Not just an organization may not be able to solve all that. So some things, a couple of things just if you want to talk about, women and different genders is like, they call it the broken rung of the career ladder. So for women, men are more often promoted into that first level supervision role than all other genders. So, really looking at maybe your numbers, right? Of just saying, okay, who are we promoting? Are we promoting, is there some kind of pipeline of promotions, things like that? So, what are, looking at how that's going there. There's also something called the glass cliff, which is that once women get to the top, they top out, maybe in like before the C suite, or maybe they're in the C suite and not in the CEO role. So, really looking at how can we intentionally build pathways for these underrepresented groups to get into these positions. Some of that may be internally, some of your practices, procedures, policies, things like that. Some of that may be, who you're hiring. Obviously, there's only so many openings the farther up you go, right?
Right.
So some of that is just basically you don't have any openings, So those are some of the, really looking at your internal talent pipeline is really important now, but especially important now because of the lack of employee engagement we have within the workplace. And then it's just a really tough labor market. So people are going to have to be really intentional about growing their own leaders.
And so that would be intentional mentorship programs,
Hmm.
and things that build connection across the organization, not just in your silo of, I work in accounting, so I'm just going to know accounting people. We've talked about those kinds of things a lot on the podcast.
Hmm.
What else would you do to, especially on earlier career stuff, to make sure that those opportunities, the things that lead to the opportunities, like I said, the mentorships and those relationships. But what else would you do early in somebody's career to ensure that as you're setting them up for financial success in the organization?
Yeah, I think one thing is job rotation. There's a strict definition of that, but just even like, can you have somebody maybe work on a project that's in another department so they get exposure across different departments? As you said, I think there's a level of mentorship, and reverse mentorship is really becoming popular. So some of the younger people sharing, with some of the older people or the more tenured people in the organization, I think having people participate in communities of practice, whether it's internal, external, or a combination of those. So maybe it's, they're in a leadership community of practice. And then I also think having learning group opportunities, people more and more, what I'm finding, I'd be curious if you see this too, Mike, of like small group learning, peer coaching has become really powerful, especially in these last few years. So I think having those kinds of opportunities are really beneficial.
So just ongoing a training and development program
Hmm.
that isn't focused on just this one employee. That, okay, we're going to select this high potential employee and keep investing in them, but bringing a group of people, of peers together to do training and cross training and those kinds of things.
Yeah, it also builds a sense of belonging, right? So think
Sure.
about your newer in your career or newer at this organization. You've got 5 or 6 people that are participating in something and kind of build, across departments, become a trusted resource for you, and you're probably going to be less likely to leave, right? If
Yeah.
you've got this, hopefully, but if you've got this group of trusted people, you can, be in cahoots with.
And so you mentioned community of practice. I'm not familiar with that term.
Hmm.
So tell me what
Yeah.
we're talking about there.
Yeah, there's community of practice is, a term used like I've been in a pay equity community of practice where it was number of organizations who were all doing pay equity, and it was all kind of C-suite level people that decided there were no other resources out there except each other. So we decided, one group decided we're going to do a monthly meeting. And so we basically just kind of came together and talked through the different things that were going on. There's some more formal communities of practice. You may see like an HR community of practice. I see this a lot in nonprofits. You may have an executive director community of practice where it's just there's some kind of thread of commonality that brings everybody together, and they can come into the space and just kind of talk about this topic and be resources for each other.
So it's like our professional associations, things like
Yeah, but
that.
they're more
Okay.
informal.
Right. Okay. Interesting. And let's take a quick break. Good Morning HR is brought to you by Imperative, premium background checks with fast and friendly service. If you're an HRCI or SHRM certified professional, this episode of Good Morning HR has been pre approved for 3/4 of a recertification credit. To obtain the recertification information, visit goodmorninghr.com and click on Research Credits. Then select episode 121 and enter the keyword compensation. That's COMPENSATION. And if you're looking for even more recertification credit, check out the webinars page at imperativeinfo.com. And now back to my conversation with Sally Loftis. So I don't want to skip pay justice. So
Hmm.
help me understand the difference between pay equity and pay justice.
Yeah, pay justice is kind of a newer term, but it's really about the systemic pieces of that. So, thinking about, you know, if- one thing I work with organizations who are like, well, I'm paying kind of what the government's telling me to pay, right?
Mhm.
Or, for instance, I live in North Carolina where our state minimum wage is 7.25. And there are other, obviously states and territories who have different ones. And so pay justice is really about saying, okay, as an organization, I can kind of wait for everybody else to tell me what to do. Or I can say systemically, I'm going to be a leader in this space, or I'm going to, really um, bring pay into more reasonable levels rather than waiting. And so sometimes, for instance, like I said, I work with nonprofits, foundations, some government groups that they may be kind of the leader in their sector or in their geographic location to say, okay, we are able to pay this wage and we're going to lead everybody to paying more. We're going to help bring up the market a little bit because doing that retains more employees in this sector or in this geographic location. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I don't want to dirty the term justice, but you mentioned what does it cost to retain this employee, and really that's economics 101 though, right? It's just it's got justice adds this sense of being maybe more noble than we really are
Mhm.
talking about when we,
Mhm.
if we're just really going to say what, this is the available workforce in this market. We're investing in training and onboarding these employees and making them successful. What's the value of this employee who's already fully integrated into our system? What's the cost of, and those are always fuzzy numbers that organizations aren't good at fooling, but what's the cost of losing this employee and replacing them? And there is some hard number though that says, well, if this wage gets above this for this job, we find a way to automate it, right? I
Mhm.
mean, and
Yeah.
it's and so, but it's a business. I think it's still got to be a business decision. So, um, let me ask. Okay, now we're really going to get into it. First, the idea that an employer should pay a livable wage. What is that definition? What is the definition of a livable wage to you when we're talking about whether and do you think an employer has a responsibility to pay a livable wage, or to pay what the market will bear and what the value of that role is to what's delivered through that role?
Wow, we could talk for hours
Yeah.
just about those
Okay.
2 questions, thank you. I will say, so a livable wage is going to be, in general, can I pay my bills day to day, month to month, whatever, to live, my basic necessities. So, what that looks like is, where a livable wage, what that might be varies by location. So, in general, the United States is about across all households. So, this goes from a single person to a person with 6 kids in the house, to
Mm-hmm.
working adults, is in general about $60,000, the cost of living, right? So, now I live in North Carolina where it's like 51,000.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So mine is lower, but then you go to Seattle, DC, you're looking at 95,000. So a livable wage is going to look different
Right.
based on where those are. So that's kind of number one. And I will say around livable wages, so asking about the responsibility of organizations and businesses. Yes, I do think organizations have a responsibility to pay livable wages. I also think other people have some responsibility around that, which is government and, the support around that. But one is because, and that's where some of the pay justice terminology comes in, is that if we're not paying people, if you really, for instance, are committed to diversity, equity, inclusion, if you're not paying people a livable wage out of the gate, you're limiting who you're recruiting. So, I mean, if you're on, for instance, if I'm, in a place that pays the cost of living is $60,000, and this is a full time year round role, and I'm only paying 45,000. Well, not all the qualified candidates can do that.
Mm-hmm.
The ones who maybe have another adult in the house who are working, or, I mean, there's different barriers. So, I do think organizations have a responsibility to pay living wages because otherwise it can be seen as exploitative. Um, and I also recognize that that's a huge leap, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially for some groups, especially small businesses. And it could mean less jobs if you have to pull those up. But I would encourage people to look at kind of the long term consequences of not paying those wages, because I would think long term, your turnover and the cost around that is going to be higher than getting to that living wage.
And you work in the comp area. I spent most of my HR career running away from anything with numbers. So comp and benefits that was not what I wanted to do. But what are you seeing? Um, since March of 2020, we've all gone
Mhm.
remote, and I'm starting to seeing a lot of my clients who have not only hybrid workplaces, but they've also got fully remote employees, and they're hiring. These engineers want to live in Wyoming and fish and hunt and do whatever you get to do in Wyoming, freeze your butt off in the winter. And so they're not, and so they're hiring, based in Texas, but they're hiring, someplace where the the regional cost of living and just the regional, the amount of opportunity you moved out, you have a lot fewer engineering jobs available to you if you live in Wyoming versus Austin. So what are you seeing there as far as regional cost affecting how employers pay? And is that just if you're really an employer that's willing to go be a multi-state employer and hire anywhere, is that just really widening the salary bands then that those employers have? And what is, from that concept of justice, what does that mean for those employees who live in New York City, those lower skill, lower demand employees who live in, New York City versus other places where the cost of living, like North Carolina or Central Texas or wherever, is significantly less?
Yeah, I've seen varied approaches to this. So you might see some organizations post a job and say, based on kind of the region of the country, here's what the salary band is. There are some organizations that just pick whatever their home city's going to be, and it may be one that's a higher cost of living than the national average. There's some people who've not even addressed this yet. I will say there's a good group out there. And so just kind of asking, so what I'm seeing around geographic location is there's certainly a wide approach. I am not a fan of organizations if somebody moves paying them less.
Yeah,
I
right.
mean,
Who's going to
right?
take that?
And I think sometimes we can get caught up in the geographic location of like, oh, well, they have, so a couple of examples here. One is, for instance, I live in a rural, 16,000 people in my county. So I live in rural North Carolina. So people will say, oh, it doesn't cost as much to live there. Well, actually, it does because we have less housing. We have to drive. If you need to go see a specialist for healthcare, you're going to drive at least an hour, if not 2 hours. You're driving longer distances, things like that. So I think sometimes we think rural means less, and that's not always true. I think also sometimes we think people are in locations and they may not be there by choice. It may be because they have family there. It may be because, they've inherited a house and it's super affordable. Or, they may be there because they're caregiving for somebody who has a lot of healthcare needs and need to have access. So I think we've got to be a lot more expansive in our geographic location piece. So I'm not the type who's like, be super strict on where people are and that's like where you pay them. I think it's for nationwide organizations, at least, I think it's more helpful to have kind of an idea of what you're going to pay versus letting it come up with every geographic location as you hire. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. And we've talked about salary, but there's a lot more that goes into comp than just salary.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The total cost of an employee, including state taxes, but also your benefits cost, whatever perquisites you've got, those kinds of things. How does that figure in when you're looking at these issues of transparency or equity or even justice? How do those things figure into trying to determine what the right dollar figure is for this job?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of times it's, having employee feedback sessions and hearing from them. So, some things I've heard from employee feedback sessions with clients of like, people being like, I'd rather than give me, $50 here for this and $25 here for this, just collapse everything into my pay. Or it may be like, I'm willing, for you to, I'd much rather you pay for 100% of my healthcare coverage than have this much professional development. So I think some of that is just listening to employees and understanding, what's there. I think once you're paying a livable wage, the discussion is different because people then can kind of look at it different because they're not as worried about paying bills month to month. So I think, yeah, I mean, those are a couple of the pieces. And then the rewards, like for me, whenever I, worked internally for HR on an annual basis, I printed out individual for every single employee that had, this is what we're paying, this is how much we pay for health insurance every year. This is how much we pay state taxes, so that they understood that it wasn't just what they were getting paid, but they could understand all the other kind of ancillary but required, things that the organization was paying on top of that.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing every employer, I'm generally against the government telling you to do it, but just out of self-defense mode, if nothing else, make sure your employees understand, we pay, 95% of your healthcare expense. And this is what that really comes out to. And here's what it would look like on the open market. I mean, if you could really say, here's what, if you get an ACA, market plan, this is what it would cost you. And so because we're buying as a group and this is what we're paying and what versus what you're paying. And that would go a long way to helping employees compare job A to job B and what their opportunities are. And I think that, a lot of times people don't, accept a job based on the salary, and they don't even understand what their benefits are and what the, really a lot of the things that make you want to work someplace are until they go through orientation. And then they're still confused because most people don't do a very good job at orientation either. So, well,
I agree with you on that. And yeah, I mean, that's a great example, the healthcare piece. A lot of times people don't have any idea. Like I've heard from employees, like, I want a healthcare plan that I don't have to change providers every year because they're trying to get the lowest price, right? Or even, for instance, an organization that may say they have unlimited paid time off. Well, there's a difference in saying you have it and then having a culture that supports it. So
right.
that's a little different question, in asking that. So those are great points you brought up.
So let's finish on this because you brought it
Okay.
up a couple of times. Unlimited time off. I think it's a
Mhm.
scam, but because I've not seen. Have you seen
Mhm.
employer truly implement unlimited PTO? And is that just for exempt employees, or how does that actually work? Because I haven't seen an example where it really works. And the companies that say they have it, I think the studies all show that those people are less likely to actually take PTO than somebody who's got a fixed amount of PTO in their bank every year.
Mm, that's good. Yeah, I love this rabbit hole. Okay,
Yeah.
let's do it.
We're going to end it on
Um,
this is a French goodbye.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
is great. Yeah, I love it. I will say, it's interesting. I see, just based on my experience, smaller businesses are able to manage this a little better, probably a little differently, because they do have a little more view on it than if you have 600 or 10,000 employees, right, doing paid time off. So I think size makes a difference here. I think also what I find is in the groups that do that, what they do really well is really more of a flexible schedule. And also maybe the senior leaders are modeling, they, instead of taking a week off, they may take 2 weeks off.
Mhm.
And so are modeling some of that for people. So those are ways that support that. But yeah, I mean, I'm with you. It's real, because there's studies that show that people, even if they have the time off, they don't take it, right? And then it's based on how it's categorized. Do you have sick time? Do you have, holidays? You have, things like that. So yeah, I think it's going to be something that may be more popular in the future, but the culture to support it is going to be really important. To your point, it can't just be words. It's got to be deeds.
And it's got to be tied back. I would think the only way it would work is tie it back to that person's total productivity. Is the job getting
Mhm.
done at the end of the day? And so we're really talking more about
Mhm.
flexibility than we are,
Mhm.
but here's what the goals are for the quarter. And here's what's got to happen on a weekly basis and how you got to support your team. But, um, you know, you take the time you need, you plan the time, you make sure that there's no other conflicts. I mean, you coordinate it. I mean, this idea that, well, it's my PTO, so I'm just going to take it today, and it's not illness. It's just I want to go do this without coordinating with the rest of the team doesn't work. But and I don't know that you can do I can see unlimited PTO for an executive or not executive, but for an exempt position.
Mhm.
I are there organizations doing it for
I was
hourly?
like, you asked me
Yeah,
that question. I was like, I don't think so. I've not
yeah.
seen
I don't
that
know.
with
Yeah,
non-exempt.
yeah.
Yeah.
That
I
would
don't think
just
that
be
would,
really a
I don't,
challenging way to
yeah, I think
account for that.
legally that would be
Yeah.
tough.
Well, thank you, Sally. That's all the time we have, but that was a really interesting conversation in an area that I only have opinions about and very little data. So thanks for sharing your background and experience.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
And thank you for listening. You can comment on this episode or search our previous episodes at goodmorninghr.com or on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube. And don't forget to follow us wherever you get your podcast. Rob Upchurch is our technical producer, and you can reach him at robmakespods.com. And thank you to Imperative's marketing coordinator, Marianne Hernandez, who keeps the trains running on time. And I'm Mike Coffey, as always. please don't hesitate to reach out if I can be of service to you personally or professionally. I'll see you next week, and until then, be well, do good, and keep your chin up.